Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study for this week. Jim Morgan, Aaron Tremblay here, continuing our Bible study on the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis. This week will likely be our final week of this Bible study, and so we want to offer one more time an encouragement. If you have a suggestion for a topic or an idea or maybe a series of questions we could answer for our next session, set of sessions together, let us know. Send us emails at the email provided here at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to consider them and pick a topic we think will be fitting for the next period of time. But as far as we can tell, for a while longer, we're going to be continuing on with online class. And
yeah, it looks like, as we were saying, it's going to be longer rather than shorter period
Correct.
of time. So we will be here. This is the last one of Joseph, but we will be here. We don't know what we're going to be talking about yet. So tune in and be surprised.
That's right. So to wrap up our study of Joseph's life, we did cover the blessings last week that Jacob passes down to his sons, which includes an additional blessing of Joseph. Again. And this week in 49, we're going to pick up in verse 28 and finish out chapter 49. And then 50 is the last chapter of the book of Genesis. And so we'll cover the end of Jacob's life and leave ourselves at the transition between Joseph, the prosperity of his brothers, and all those things going into Exodus 1 and the transition that happens with the new Pharaoh and those kind of things.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in. Chapter 49, verse 28, it says, "All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him." So a couple of interesting points, I think, there in 28. I don't know if Simeon and Levi necessarily considered themselves blessed after what Judah had said.
I'm pretty sure Reuben didn't.
But notice that it says the blessing that was suitable to him.
Yeah,
Each one
NIV has given each the blessing appropriate to him.
So even though we might look at what Reuben got, we might say, oh, I don't know if that was a great blessing, but it was the blessing that was suitable or appropriate for him. And remember, Jacob, even in that instance, specifies, this is why you're getting the blessing that you're getting.
Yeah, and with each of them, as we talked about last week, there is the possibility this could work out for you.
Correct.
This could be a good thing.
This is
take what you've got, run with it.
This isn't a predestination blessing.
No.
This is what Jacob potentially foresees, but can be influenced if they make the decision to change.
Yeah, and the way we read it through 21 centuries this side of the cross. Mm-hmm. They're several thousand years before the cross.
Correct.
And so their culture, their habits, their way of looking at things are not the same as ours.
Good point.
And so, we may look at it and think, what kind of a blessing is that? But if you were there, that's a great blessing. Mm-hmm. Even the one about, you'll have good food.
And even the sons who really struggled, and quite frankly, Simeon and Levi, Jacob seems to be on real bad terms with them still, and harboring some. He still addresses them and speaks to them and includes them in his family. That's a blessing. Mm-hmm. That he doesn't say, now look, based on what you did, you get nothing.
You're out.
Don't even show up for the blessings, right?
Yeah.
So, again, just the idea that each one receives a blessing according to what's appropriate. Verse 29 says, "Then he commanded them and said to them." Now, I want you to take a second and kind of think about this, that this is a command that Jacob is making to his sons. It tells you how important what he's about to say is. This is the end of his life. It's going to be one of his final statements he makes to his children. He commands them and says to them, "I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place." So we've been talking about all along, I know we've mentioned several times, the importance in the Old Testament of being buried with your fathers, being buried with the family. And Jacob, this is not the first time he's brought this up. Back in chapter 47, when he was talking just to Joseph, he said, "You promise me, put your hand under my thigh and promise, swear to me that you will bury me with my fathers."
And Joseph's going to return to it as well. Mm-hmm. So, this is... to not be buried with your family is considered a disaster.
Absolutely.
No matter how good a life you lived or it's just a disaster if you're not buried with your family. Again, when you get over to the kings, you can tell that the king is really bad when it says, and he's not buried with the other kings. He's buried off somewhere else by himself.
That's right.
So, yeah, this is, again, it's their culture. They understand it. You know, we hear people say, well, you know, just toss me in a box and, you know, whatever. I don't care. I'm not going to be there. Well, they didn't see it that way.
That's right.
They didn't see it. As a matter of fact, the Jews are even going to go so far as to develop a theory, and this shows up in various places in the New Testament, where the soul hangs around for about 3 to 4 days to make sure that everything is done right. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, then he'll come back and get you. So, you know, that's the reason why it's important that Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Okay, his soul has gone on now that he's made sure. And by the way, Jesus, he was quite ticked at you when you didn't show up.
Right.
You know, and in the book of Revelation, you know, the witnesses are going to stay dead for 3.5 days. It's almost over. But no, nick of time, Jesus comes riding in and rescues everybody. So it's a very big deal.
Oh, it is. And burial places play a big, significant role. We get later on into the Messianic prophecies where you're buried, mm-hmm. and the direction in which you're facing when you're buried becomes mm-hmm. significant, because the Messiah, you want to be one of the first ones that the Messiah comes to when he returns.
Yeah. You don't want to show him your back when he shows up.
Right, exactly. And so it becomes a big deal. Yeah. And there's been a lot of conversations even in more contemporary context about burial and what the right way to be buried is and those kind of things.
Can we be cremated and still be resurrected?
Correct. Exactly.
Just all sorts of things come up. This pandemic, you know, for these people, the really big part would be that you can't hold funerals. Mm-hmm. That to them, that would be the ultimate catastrophe. Yes, you know, people are getting sick. Yes, people are dying. But what do you mean you're not able to hold a funeral? There's no way in the world we've got to do this.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, in New York City, if you remember, one of the first things the mayor got in trouble with was the very conservative Jewish group holding a funeral. Mm-hmm. And he sent the police in to bust it up, and things haven't been the same since. Yeah. So even today, it's a big thing.
It is, because there's so much finality to it. But as we're going to learn with Joseph too, it's the idea of a place to return to mm-hmm. for God's people. Because
even if it's going to take centuries.
That's right, to get back there. And let's remember now, Jacob's been in Egypt for about 17 years when we get to the point that he's dying. Mm-hmm. And Jacob doesn't want to be permanently associated with Egypt. And even though Israel, by and large, they're a nomadic people, he specifies, we bought this land and it legally belongs to us. It's our right mm-hmm. to bury there. Even though they've been known to be nomadic and move around, this is a place that we continue to own. Bring me back to the land that was bought. And
if you go back to the story, you know, when Abraham buys it, mm-hmm. When Sarah dies, he goes to the people who own it. He says, you know, I need to buy the land. They said, no, take it. It's yours. We want you to have it. He says, no. I'm buying this. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that even though you're nomadic, there's a place you return to when you die. Mm-hmm. And Jacob is going to be specific about that. Verse 31, there Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. And the field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. So what you're talking about, we bought this.
That's right.
And so it's very important that, we're going to go back there. And it's got to break his heart when he says that and Rachel's not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big deal. And the fact that he's going to be buried with Leah, who was
not his
also
first choice.
His wife, but not really the one he wanted.
She was a second-round draft pick.
That's right. But notice, I think that further emphasizes the importance of being buried with his fathers. Mm-hmm. They know where Rachel's buried. It's not like they can't find it to bring him back there, but he wants to be with his fathers where they're buried.
Yeah.
And so even though it means being buried with Leah instead of Rachel, it's still his fathers. That's where he wants to go. Mm-hmm. That's where he wants to be brought back to. And by the way, that place also is within the borders of the Promised Land.
Yeah.
So that's significant because in a very real sense, I think the idea of the Promised Land is kind of lost for all those centuries. And the only thing that ties God's people back to that place 200 years later, because there's no one living there really from them, is that's where our forefathers are buried, and that's where we mm-hmm. have to bring Joseph back to. We still have a piece of us that belongs there, even though we've been gone from there for 300 and then 400 years, right? Yep. So it really is an important thing that we're talking about here. And that's why it says Jacob commands them. That's why in 47 and verses 29 and 30, he tells Joseph, swear to me that you'll bury me there. So 33 says, when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people.
I think that's interesting there because, one of the big discussions in Old Testament studies is whether or not there's the idea of life after death, of, is there any part of you that survives? And it was gathered to his people. Some people say, yeah, well, he was talking about, just being buried with them. No, he was gathered to his people. He hadn't gone back and been buried yet. That's still way in the future. But he's still gathered to his people. There's something about his people that he has been taken to. And so I think there's a lot more hints or, suggestions or whatever in the Old Testament about life after death. Because, Jesus is going to say that, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, they've been dead for a long time, but there's still something about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he is the God of. So, I think that's the important part of this. When he's gathered to his people, there's some part of him that goes to join them.
And as we learned from the Joseph narrative earlier on, when something's repeated, it's for the sake of importance. It's specified in the text. So it says it here twice. When I go to be gathered with my people, and then when he dies, at that instance, he was gathered to his people. So I think you're exactly right.
And I think twice here and several times before that.
Right.
So go ahead.
And so the text is just emphasizing for us, I think, hey, this is an important point. And I think if it was just saying that he got buried with them, it wouldn't have to keep making that point because it's just going to talk about that in chapter 50 anyway.
And it would say something, and then they took him back home, and he was gathered to his people.
Right,
no,
buried there.
When he died, he was gathered to his people. So I think that's just a very important point.
It is. So now we're jumping into chapter 50. So for those of you from our local congregation who might pick on Jim and I for being kind of slow, this is 2 chapters in 1 week we're touching on.
That's right.
So this is pretty impressive stuff.
So we don't want to hear anything more. Well, okay, you're going to.
So here we are, chapter 50 and verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Now, several important things in this part of the story. Obviously, we see in Joseph's emotional reaction what we would anticipate from a son who loved his father. But to go on from there, Joseph has Jacob embalmed, so in one sense he's buried as an Egyptian would be. He's treated as an Egyptian after he dies. And then furthermore, the extra time that's taken to do that, it doesn't say, and just his brothers and those who came with them from Canaan wept for the loss of Jacob. But it says the Egyptians wept for Jacob, and not for a day, and not for a couple hours, but for 70 days.
A long mourning period.
So I think that's pretty significant.
Yeah, I think it's significant in that this is, and really I don't think it's Jacob, it's Joseph. This is Joseph's daddy, and because we are so respectful of Joseph, because Joseph is so important to us, we feel his pain.
And remember, it's important that he's being embalmed because most of the time, as people die in the Old Testament, they're not too far from where they end up ultimately getting buried. But now we're talking about you're going to have to take a dead body from Egypt all the way to Hebron, basically, is where the area in which Jacob is buried. And so when he's embalmed, that's to preserve the body, to make the journey, to get back to...
Yeah, there would be all sorts of complications if it wasn't.
Even without the old law being in place yet, as far as being unclean, we're talking about a corpse going and being into putrefaction. I'm not trying to be gross, but I'm just saying you're transporting a decaying corpse for this distance.
Well, in the words of the Lazarus story, Lord, he stinks.
Yeah, Lord, he stinks.
So, it's just a fact of life. Joseph realizes, okay, Daddy's down here. We're going to have to take him back. This is the only way this is going to happen.
To make that journey.
Yeah.
And it's not something that was practiced by the Hebrews, didn't do embalming.
No.
So that's why he has to leave it to the Egyptian physicians. Is that what the NIV calls them too?
Yeah, physicians.
Physicians.
Yeah.
So he has to leave that to them.
Yeah. And the Israelites returned to the earth. That's now the bones, different story. Even today they will leave the corpse for a year, come back, collect the bones, and put them in the bone boxes, whatever you want to call that. But it's if you've ever seen the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there's a whole section there about how the pharaohs are embalmed, and it is amazing. the thoroughness that they go through.
Well, yeah, I mean, 40 days
Yeah.
it takes to do it. I mean, that's a long time
That is a long
to go through that
time.
process. But let's think about how long does that process last?
Mhm.
They put 40 days into it, but then how long is that body preserved for?
Any mummy we find in Egypt, no
That's
matter
right.
from
We're
where,
talking
is still
thousands
going to
of
be, you know,
years.
it's leathery,
Mhm.
but it's still there.
And there's still DNA and stuff in there that
Yeah.
they can take. So, I mean, and just think about this fact too. Not only does he have to be transported, but look at the length of time that the mourning goes on.
Mhm.
70 days. That is not a normal biblical period of time for mourning for people.
No.
But what it tells us is when somebody's mourned for that period of time, it tells you the honor that they're being given and the important role that they had among the people who are mourning them. So
Mhm.
even though it's only a couple of verses there, I think there's some significant things that we learn about what's going on and the influence that Joseph and therefore Jacob had in Egypt. Verse 4 says, "And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die, in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, and then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear."
That's going to carry real implications when you get over into Exodus.
Yes.
And Pharaoh doesn't even want them to go out into the
That's
desert
exactly
to
what
worship.
I was thinking.
Yeah. So, you know, that's the obvious connection here.
Mhm.
There was a time when, you know, we could go all the way back to Canaan. If we'd wanted to stay there, we could have stayed there.
Mhm.
But instead, we came back. Now, we can't even go out into the desert to worship.
And I mean, notice there's a lot of language here in terms of swearing or a covenant that exists.
Mhm.
You know, there's this commitment, I have to go. And when God wants his people to go worship, it's not just a commitment, hey, I made this commitment to my dad. It's
Yeah.
we owe this commitment to God
Mhm.
to go and do this. And Pharaoh
And-
still doesn't care.
Yeah, and Pharaoh knows Joseph is a man of his word,
Mhm.
and that's the important part. He knows that he can trust Joseph. So if Joseph has sworn to do something, Pharaoh's not going to stand in his way because that's what makes Joseph so valuable to him.
That's right.
And if he tells him, I don't care what you swore, well, then he's going to destroy Joseph's effectiveness.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
It's a good point. And again, just notice who Joseph is. He doesn't have to keep his promise. His dad's dead. I mean,
Yeah.
so he doesn't have to. He owes his brothers nothing. I mean,
But he's
so-
Joseph.
But he's Joseph. He's a godly man, and therefore he gave his word to his father. He's going to keep his word. You want to pick up in 7?
Yeah. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, and the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household, and his brothers, and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. And chariots and horsemen also went up with him, and it was a very large company.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the government basically shuts down. Everybody goes. So all of the officials, you know, you look at one of these, when a president dies, you look at who shows up and you realize how important he was. But it's not like the whole government shows up.
Mm-hmm.
Here, everybody shows up.
And it shows, I think, a two-way trust too, because Joseph, his brothers, all the men of the father's house are gone.
Mm-hmm.
The only people who can protect their flocks and their herds and everything
Yeah.
else. But they leave all that stuff behind, which says they're not concerned anything's going to happen to it while they're gone.
I think it also points to the fact, it says chariots and horsemen,
Mm-hmm.
security, because apparently the Canaan always has had a reputation for being a rough place.
Yeah.
And they don't want Joseph and his brothers and everybody going in there and getting killed. So they're going to send, you know, some pretty good
Protection.
security forces
Secret
with
Service.
them. To make, yeah, that's exactly. They had the little whippy things going into their ears, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So verse 10, unless you got anything, when they had reached the threshing floor of Atad near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. And when the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning, and that is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. And if you got an NIV, the footnote says it means mourning of the Egyptians. And that's mourning with a U, not
Right.
the sun coming up.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows something important is going on here. Generally, when the Egyptians show up in your neighborhood, it's not a good thing.
That's right.
But in this case, they're there and everybody recognizes their sorrow, and that's what's going on. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with the field. And after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father.
So this is the ending of an age, in a manner of speaking, for one of the patriarchs at least.
Yeah, the last of the patriarchs.
And that's significant. It's important that, I think it's important that the text gives this much recognition to this transition that's taking place.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't just say, and Jacob died and got buried. It's given us a lot of detail, a lot of information here, because this is a really important transition in terms of the overall arc of the narrative of the Bible.
Yeah.
You know?
Because, this is the last of the patriarchs, so if you look at it, the foundation now has been laid. Now we wait, and the next thing that's important is going to be the law of Moses. And then after that, we're going to go to Jesus. So what started in Genesis, back in the creation, the promise that God made that somebody's going to come who's going to redeem mankind, we're still moving towards that. And all of the things that people have done to mess it up in Genesis, and man, you think about how many times this whole plan could have gotten derailed. But God knew what he was doing. God knows how to keep things moving forward. And we realize God's got them right where he wants. They're protected. Now they're about to find out what it's like to be a slave, because there's some important theological implications there. You're a slave to sin. You don't want to. You want to be a slave to God. You don't want to be a servant of unholiness. You want to be a servant. So slavery is going to become something, and God tells them, when you see these people coming into your land, you remember that you were a slave, and you treat those people the way you wanted to be treated.
Through some of the writers like Paul is going to specifically refer back to those instances in a theological way and their implications on our perspective as Christians. And I think your point is an important one. You go back to Genesis 1 and what we're introduced to in the beginning as the fall happens in Genesis 3, and we're introduced to this idea that God is going to find a way to reestablish a connection with mankind, that he can dwell with them, that they can dwell with him. But it's not real specific there, just that there's a plan. Now we're 50 chapters into Genesis, and we've gone from there's a plan to there's a tribe. The tribe of Judah. That's who is going to be the one. And so now, even just staying in the book of Genesis, we've gone a great distance in terms of what God has revealed in his plan. And you think about with Abraham and Isaac, the imagery and the allusions there to Jesus and the sacrifice of his son. And so, as we talk about, joke about, everything goes back to Genesis.
It does.
We're only 50 chapters into the Bible, and yet we're kind of...
The foundation's there.
Yeah, everything is kind of there. And now the exciting thing about being in Genesis 50 is now we're to the point that or Genesis 49, we've narrowed it down to a tribe. We know that the one who's going to fulfill what God spoke about in Genesis 3 is going to come through Judah. And so now as we leave Joseph at the end of Genesis, and Joseph dies, and his influence, by the way, dies off with him once we get into Exodus, now we're not looking towards Joseph anymore. Now we're looking towards Judah. What's going to happen with Judah? Where does Judah fit in when we get to the other side of the slavery? Because that's the line we want to follow to take us to the one that God has promised to save humanity through.
Yeah, everything else is supporting Judah. That's what the rest of your brothers will bow down. Your brothers will serve you. Well, not though in the sense, hey, I want y'all to do this for me. No, they're going to serve you while you fulfill your purpose, which is to get to Jesus.
And so, what is the point of Genesis? Why does Genesis take us through all these people? It's taking us through all of these things to help us to understand how did we get from Adam to Judah? Because Judah's going to take us to Jesus. So if we want to backtrack and figure out, okay, well, where did this come from? We go back to Judah, and well, where did Judah come from? And that's kind of... So again, everything goes back to Genesis. 50 chapters in, though, we've covered a lot of ground.
And it establishes a pattern, because at the beginning, you got Adam and Eve. Well, then it expands. and then it goes back down to Noah, and then it expands, and then it goes back down to Abraham, and then it expands, and now it's going to come back together. Then they're going to become a great nation, and then it's going to expand down to where it's just Jesus, and then it's going to open back up again, and then it's going to, when we get to heaven, few are going to make it.
That's right.
So it's a pattern that's going to repeat itself all the way through, but it goes back to Genesis.
Yeah, so as we're looking at these things, you see these significant events and some of these threads of the gospel that we're talking about. It should be an exciting thing. It should be an encouraging thing to go back to read the Old Testament because we know thousands of years ahead of this already what the fulfillment's going to be. But now we can go back and say, wow, look in Genesis 50. God was already, his plan's developing. Man, so let's pick up in 15.
Okay.
It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So, we talked about before.
Guilty conscience is a horrible thing.
How long their guilt had lasted when they're finally in front of Joseph and they all look at this is happening because of what we did to Joseph and his screams of his soul that he cried out as he left. And we think all that guilt's gone. It's been 17 more years that they've lived in Egypt.
You look at everything that Joseph has done for them. Well, yeah, but it was only because Daddy was alive.
That's right.
Guys, can you not accept forgiveness? That's the problem. We can't. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to accept forgiveness.
They think the only reason that Joseph has tolerated them was because Jacob was still
there and would have whooped him or something.
Yeah, and so now panic sets in. Jacob's gone. Our protection is gone. Joseph's going to go back to doing everything that he wanted to do to us. Mm-hmm. So there, I think you said this before in an earlier class, people oftentimes perceive in someone else what they anticipate their reaction would be based on what they would do if they were in his shoes.
Yeah.
So they're looking at Joseph saying, man, if I was Joseph, here's what I'd do. I'd whoop all of us,
Yeah.
But
here's where we're going to get it now. But, and even today, people have a tremendous difficulty believing that God can actually forgive us. Because you think about how many people think and are worried about and just lose sleep at night. What if there's a sin I haven't repented of? Mm-hmm. I'll go to hell. God wants you in heaven. Mm-hmm. And God's a very stubborn individual.
Yeah.
So, you take care of what you can take care of, and I'm pretty sure that God's big enough to take care of the rest of it. But we have a hard time accepting that.
We do. And you see man's perspective on forgiveness in places like when they asked Jesus, well, how many times though? Mm-hmm. I know I have to forgive, but how many times? When can I say, I don't have to forgive him anymore?
Yeah. I actually heard of a case where, they got the black boxes in airplanes, mm-hmm. and there was a crash. And, everybody was killed. And at the end of it, the black box clearly picked up, and the pilot was a Christian, clearly picked up where he said a bad word. And I actually heard people argue, well, that's it, he was lost because he never had time to repent of that. Mm. I think that gets into the brothers here. If you just can't accept the fact that you are forgiven. Mm. And, if our kids do something bad against us, there may be punishment. But they don't stop being our daughter or our son.
That's right.
In our case, daughters.
And that's where you talk about grace versus law.
Yeah.
Law says, if you didn't have time, therefore, grace says, even if I had time, I still wouldn't have deserved the forgiveness.
Yeah.
And the first, no matter how you break it down, I'm relying on grace versus law.
And that's the whole point in the New Testament. It's not Old Testament versus New Testament. It's, do you really think you're going to be saved by keeping all these laws? You can't do it. Or are you going to be saved by grace? Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with Old Testament and New Testament. It has to do with the grace of God versus what we think, which is we have to keep the law perfectly or else, man, we're just not going to make it. That's
right. And I don't think, even Paul probably would have referred to it more as the law and does, mm-hmm. as opposed to the Old Testament.
Yeah. When he says the law, he's talking about a principle of legalism. Mm-hmm. You're not saved by legalism. You're not saved by checklist. Mm-hmm. You're saved by the grace of God. It has nothing to do with, well, we can just throw those 39 books away now. We don't need them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so verse 15.
So they're all panicking because of this concern that Joseph is now going to execute his retribution. Mm-hmm. And in 16 he says, so they sent a message to Joseph. So they don't actually go talk to their brother, who they've now been living around for 17 years. They send a messenger because their assumption is if we went ourselves, the Lord only knows what would happen to us. Your father gave this command before he died. Oh, this is just
Is this typical?
Yeah,
folks, we've been emphasizing this all along. When these people talk, it's not necessarily what's actually been said.
That's right. And they're just trying to cover themselves here. Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph.
They're lying.
They're absolutely lying. And that's kind of the concerning part, is after everything that's happened and the transformation of like Judah that we've seen and these other things, that they still come back to lying to protect themselves, which is where they started all those years ago when they lied to their father about what happened to their brother.
Yeah.
So it's kind of concerning, but let's look at what they say. It says, say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants.
17 years.
17 years of living together, and this is where they come to. And I will say this for the brothers, at least in this statement that they're dealing with, they acknowledge two things. There has been transgression and evil that was carried out against you by us, and we require, forgiveness is necessary.
Yeah.
At least in this statement, all this that they make, they cover those two things, and God is mentioned in all of this, right? So they lie, and they're just trying to cover themselves, but at least they say there was sin, evil against you, and we need forgiveness. But they lie and say, Dad is saying you have to do it.
And it's not really a good thing when you bring God in to bear witness to a lie.
Yeah, no, that's not a good thing.
That just never works well.
So the funny thing, or not funny, but Joseph weeps in response to what they said, which I'm assuming the reason that he's weeping is nothing's changed.
I can't believe these guys.
Yeah. And so then his brothers come. They must hear his response, that he cried in response. And they thought, oh man, we got to pull out all the stops now. So they go and they bow down again before Joseph and say, behold, we are your servants. And here's Joseph's response to this messenger that they send, and they're bowing down before him.
I will say this. This has to be the most thoroughly fulfilled dream in the entire history of the world.
Man, absolutely.
Brothers keep bowing down all over the place.
So true. Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Now this is interesting to me, that Joseph says, don't be afraid, for am I in the place? In other words, there should be judgment against transgression, but it's not going to come from me, it's going to come from God.
It's God.
So I don't know if that's a good thing, or I'd rather have judgment from Joseph against me than the judgment of God.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
On the other hand, it is interesting that this early, Joseph recognizes that being judged by God doesn't necessarily lead to eternal damnation.
True.
There's already a grace here, because Joseph knows what he's going to do, and he says, am I in the place of God? If I can do this, how much more can God do this?
Well, and the interesting thing with Joseph is all along, as we go, if you were to go back and read through the chapters and look at all of Joseph's references to past events, especially when he talks to his brothers, he keeps giving God the credit, not them.
Yeah.
God sent me here. God purposed this. God used me to save people.
Which is what's about to happen.
Exactly. And that's where verse 20 comes in. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So, I know we probably hear this verse quoted a lot. It ties in well with, Romans 8, where it talks about things working together for good for those who love the Lord.
Or God works in all things for the good of his people.
That's right. And I mean, so this kind of ties into that in the sense that even though Satan may intend evil for us, even though there's places like Acts 4 where we have the prayer of the believers, and we see them, it talks about this idea that, Herod intended evil, all these people, the Gentiles, the Jews, all of them working Pilate, working against Jesus to bring about evil, intending harm to him, and yet God fulfilled through all of that his good purpose, and that Christ fulfilled the will of God.
Yeah, Peter's sermon in Acts 2.
I mean, it's right there in the text. It's this, but it's in the New Testament. Satan intended all these things for evil. And by the way, this is a great verse to tie with Job. that Satan clearly intended all that stuff for evil against Job, but God.
Well, Satan intends everything for evil.
Well, yeah, that's true. Okay, that's the way to cover
He's
it.
a one-trick pony.
And by that same token, God intends everything for good.
Yeah.
And,
Well, someone said that's the difference between temptation and test.
mhm,
A temptation is what Satan does, and he wants you to fail. God tests you, and he wants you to pass.
good point.
And that's why God doesn't tempt,
Mhm.
because God doesn't want you to fail. God wants you to succeed.
And this statement to me, coming from a person like Joseph or a person like Job or a person like Jesus, comes with a lot more weight to it.
Mhm.
You know, for me to say this today, that some of the things I've gone through, God intended for good, even though they were hard and difficult things, is a very different statement I would make today than it would mean when I was 10 years old, saying,
Oh, yeah.
with everything I've been through. You know?
Yeah.
And as we go through, I think it just becomes more true, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And someone like Joseph, who's been through a fake death, sold to slavery, in prison, forgotten by, I don't know if I call them his friends, but forgotten by people whom he had helped, and all these other things, he can still look back and see the goodness of God throughout his life and say God had a purpose all along and used all these things to bring salvation and keep all these people alive.
Yeah, and it's not that, it's more true now. It's always been that true. We're just in a better position to appreciate it.
And observe it, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where faith comes
There's
from.
things now that
faith.
I can look at, and I understand them in a completely different way. The thing hasn't changed. My apprehension of it has.
Good point.
And the older we get, hopefully, the more we recognize that. We look back at things that were just awful at the time. I mean, I can look back at some, okay. But, and now I realize that it has brought me here. And I wouldn't change anything if it meant I wasn't going to be here
Amen.
with the family I've got and with the friends I've got. And I can appreciate that now. And I'm glad it all happened.
Great point. Yeah. And here's the thing, we're at a pivotal point, and this is huge for us to think about in respect to today, all the things going on in the world,
Oh, yeah.
all the division and those kind of things. Joseph is at a point right now, and he has the power to do it, to exact revenge for the evil that these guys have carried out against him, to divide himself from them and say, go back to Canaan where you came from, Dad's gone, I don't need you for money, I don't need you for anything.
And I'm not sending security with
That's
you.
right.
You're on your own.
Or just kill him right there. I mean, but Joseph doesn't choose to perceive things through a lens where everything is these guys' fault. I almost hear Jesus' words here, forgive them for they knew not what they were doing.
Yeah.
Your brothers were dumb and they committed these
Yeah.
sins. But and then you look in verse 21, he says, so do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. It's like, that's the opposite of what Joseph should have been doing to them all along. When they first showed up, he should have killed them all.
Yeah.
But it goes back to kind of a little bit of what we talked about Sunday from Ephesians 4. Joseph responds with humility. Forget about me in this. God was doing something that's bigger than me, right? That humility, gentleness. Look at how he treats them. Not only am I going to allow you to live or whatever, no, I'm gonna take care of you. I got you. I'm going to provide for you and your children, and patience. If anybody has patience in the Bible, it's Joseph with his own family, right? And bearing with one another in love. That's the fourth thing that Ephesians 4 talks about when it comes. Joseph wants unity with his brothers.
Yeah.
And he finds that unity in seeing God having a role in everything that's happened in his life. If he wanted to find division, he could say, you did this stuff to me in the past, therefore I'm justified to do this to you, But that's not what Joseph is looking for. And I think we have to see there was opportunity for that to happen here, but he chooses a different road. He chooses unity. He chooses a godly perspective as opposed to a worldly perspective.
Yeah. It's power. Okay, for the world today, power means I can tell you what to do and you have to do it. Jesus says that he has all power, and then he bends down to wash feet. Because power is not the power to make people do what you want. It's power is you can do what you need to do. And that's the difference between the Christian and the worldly view of power. Is power to be used for other people, or is it to be used on other people? And that's still obviously a cycle we're not going through well.
And Jesus says, the least of you shall become the greatest, right?
Yeah.
And
And he became a servant. He was the Son of God. He was God. And he became a servant. Well, who are you to think that everybody has to do what you want?
Absolutely. So it says, thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Again, it just, you have to think that Joseph can do whatever he wants. I mean, he could have before anyway, but
Yeah.
he's comforting them and speaking kindly to them. They sold him into slavery. I mean,
Yep.
and
They're the ones who can't comprehend what he's doing, so
That's
he
right.
has to.
and Joseph's,
It's like us telling the world why we treat people the way we do instead of the way that other people do.
That's right.
Well, it's because of what Jesus did for me. Joseph has to take care of his brothers because they can't comprehend kindness.
and they haven't been through what Joseph has been through, which is
No.
what shapes his heart. He's been through all those hardships and trusted God, so his heart looks very different than it
Yeah.
would have if he never would have, if he would have lived his whole life as a spoiled brat. His heart would have been in a different place than it is now, trusting
Yeah.
God through so many difficult things.
Tell you what, though, that must have been a long trip back from Canaan.
Oh, it must have been brutal because obviously they've been. And
They've been thinking about this.
look at all the time they have.
Yeah.
The 40 days to get embalmed, the 70 days of mourning, the trip. And we know their first thought as soon as he dropped dead was, Joseph's going to get us.
Oh, man.
They saw the chariots lining up at their house to pick him up.
There's going to be more funerals.
Yeah. So you're absolutely, I didn't even think of that. But all the time they've had now to contemplate and come up with this plan of sending this messenger is incredible.
Yeah.
You want to pick up in 22?
That trip from Canaan to Egypt, every time somebody makes the trip, it just doesn't seem to go very well.
And
The trip itself,
Right.
what happens at the other end is immaterial. That trip itself, after that first time when everybody goes down there, now they got to go back and they got to tell their daddy what happened. Now they got to go back and wonder what's going to happen when they get there. And now we got to go back and convince daddy, and then we got to move back. And now we're going to bury daddy. And oh man,
That's a good
that
point.
trip just doesn't ever seem to work
And it
well.
reminds me of the one when they found the stuff in the first bag and it
Yeah.
said the fear of God came upon them or whatever. They
Man.
were trembling. I mean,
Yeah.
you're right.
So Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all of his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. And then Joseph said to his brothers, and here we come back again to this point, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Now, the big one here is God will come to your aid. Joseph realizes something bad's going to happen. I don't know if God revealed it to him, sort of like Moses going up onto the mountain and seeing things. I don't know if Joseph had a dream. But it doesn't say God will come and, everybody will give you a going away party and we'll all go back to Canaan. God will surely come to your aid. And so, yeah, he recognizes something bad's going to happen. But he also believes that just as God rescued him, God's going to rescue his people. And if God made a promise, then God's going to keep that promise.
Absolutely. And we know from Hebrews that this idea of the remembrance of the bones of Joseph and they're being moved into the promised land is one of the things that bore so much importance from the narrative of Joseph, that's what his life
Yeah, the one high point of his life.
Yeah.
Of his life.
And I think it's because that's the part of Joseph's life that lived beyond him. Joseph lived 110 years. It's nothing to shake a stick at in terms of how long he lives.
But it's not as long as the lives of his fathers.
That's right.
As Jacob said, he lived 130 years.
130, and his fathers before him lived longer.
Yeah, lived
than
longer.
he did.
So now lifelines are definitely going down here. But just that's why it looks like the book ends on a downer. The book ends on a statement of faith. My bones will go back to where they belong. And even though, I don't know if Joseph knew it was going to take 400-something years, right. But he knew that whenever it was, he would be taken back. And again, that just gives you an idea how important this is to him. You think, well, what does Joseph care? He's dead, yeah. But there's something about wanting to go to be gathered to your people, wanting to be buried with your people, wanting to get up in the morning when the Messiah, comes with your people, whatever. But the book ends as a statement of faith, and the book of Hebrews tells us that this is one of the great statements of faith in the Bible, that Joseph spoke of his bones.
And it's mentioned, you think about this, it is mentioned in Genesis and Hebrews. It's also mentioned in Exodus, because Moses takes the bones out with him.
Yep.
Then it's mentioned at the end of Joshua, because he's actually the one that's going to bring them to where they get to their resting place.
Yep.
So significant is this that it's mentioned in 4 biblical books under, maybe not sure who exactly wrote Hebrews, but we've got Moses is writing in Genesis, Moses is writing, and then Moses is the one who's carrying out the action in Exodus. And then in the book of Joshua, we find another great individual who's involved in the story of the moving of Joseph's bones. And so here's what I take away. What's so significant about this is God takes care of and is faithful to his promises to Joseph even after he dies. You know, just like Joseph was faithful to his father's promise, or faithful to the promise he made to his father, even after Jacob had died.
It's like we've been saying all along, or the church has been saying all along, not all problems have to be solved here.
Yeah.
God will take care of this.
And even if I die, doesn't mean that God doesn't care. I mean, what happens? No, God's still faithful to his word. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 400 years, 1,000 years. It doesn't matter. God's faithful to his word.
And if you really want to wrap up, I guess, if you really want to see what happens, take the first 2 chapters of Genesis, read the last 2 chapters of Revelation, and you realize that what God has done is he's got us back to where he wanted us to be in the first place. God will take care of things. Maybe not the way we want, maybe not the way we insist, but God will take care of things.
Yeah, and Jesus and Judah mentioned in Genesis, Jesus and Judah mentioned in Revelation, the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
God just being
the
faithful.
Lion of the tribe of Judah.
God just being faithful and fulfilling promises. It's what Joseph's story is all about.
Yeah.
Faithfulness of God.
That's what Genesis is. Well, that's what the Bible's about. The faithfulness of God.
True.
God is faithful even if we're not.
Amen.
So I guess that about wraps this one up.
It does.
We've got something that we'll be doing next week. We don't have a clue what it is.
But it'll be good, and it'll be from the Bible.
And it'll be biblical.
Those 2 things we can tell you.
Absolutely. So write us. Tell us how we're doing. Tell us what you want us to do. So
And
thank
we'll
you.
see you next week.